Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.
Hello, and welcome once again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. We're very pleased that you chose to spend a few minutes with us today and hope that you'll feel it was worthwhile. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host for this, the 63rd episode in our journey through Mark's Gospel. Today, we're delighted to have Andre and... Can I start again, Steph?
Yeah, of course.
Hello, and welcome once again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. We're very pleased you chose to spend a few minutes with us today and hope you'll feel it was worthwhile. My name's David Payne. I'll be your host for this, which is the 63rd episode, believe it or not, in our journey through Mark's Gospel. We're nearly at the end. Today, we're delighted to have Andre and Mary-Anne Rabe from South Africa. Very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
You have a website called alwayslove.net, which I love to start with. And you say your passion is helping others create more meaningful and beautiful lives. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about what you do in your different ways and how you work together. It'd be lovely to hear from you.
Absolutely. You want to go?
Yeah. So we met as teenagers with a passion for just communicating the gospel. We were 18, got married 3 months after we met, and we took off and gosh, you know, with a passion for communicating the gospel. But if we look at where we are today, that message and the meaning has just exploded and expanded over the years. And I often think of the Narnia story where Lucy meets Aslan, and you know, she says, "Aslan, you're bigger," and he says, "Yes, because you are older." She says, "No, but you're not older." "No, each year that you grow, you will find me bigger." And, you know, we've continued to just be surprised by the largeness and the expansion of this beautiful message, this beautiful God that we are involved with. And so we minister all over. Probably the majority of our ministries within the USA and Europe. We've also lived in England for 10 years. And yes, we are passionate about people experiencing God in a more meaningful way, experiencing themselves in a more meaningful way, and experiencing others in a more meaningful way.
I think what Mary-Anne mentioned about there was a passion about this message when we first met, and the essence has grown and exploded. But a lot of the stuff that we thought was essential in the beginning has proven to be rather worthless. And I think many people in their faith journeys go through those places where we question a lot of the things that we used to be so dogmatic about. And we often find ourselves in that context where people are questioning, where they no longer relate to their tradition the way they used to. And we find that extremely exciting because it helps us dig deeper into the kind of understanding, the kind of concepts that that gives us more than dogmatic certainty, the kind of concepts that influences our experience and enriches it. And so that's really our focus, that with all the ideas that we explore, what is its relevance? Does it actually enrich life experience? Yeah.
Fantastic. And is that right? You met Stefan after I'd left last year at the Edinburgh Fringe, or in Edinburgh anyway?
We did, yes. We were privileged to see him perform a portion of the Mark Gospel there as well. Mm-hmm. So it was really special.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Good. Well, it's lovely to have you with us. And I gather you're having a bit of home time at the moment in South Africa.
We are.
Yes. We've traveled a lot in the past year, but for the foreseeable future, I'm busy transforming a dissertation into a book. So kind of at the end of that, so within the next month, hopefully that will be finished before it goes for a peer review. And the conferences that we are doing in the next few months are mainly online. So there's a Gerardian conference to do with mimetic theory that will happen on the 19th of August. So there's a few things happening, but thankfully we can do it from home.
We also run an online school called Mimesis Academy. So that's something that we continually busy with and developing. And yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to have you with us today. Stefan, I know as we record this today in the beginning of August, you're about to set out on your longest ever run of Iron Mark at the Edinburgh Fringe, possibly your last. But I wonder, for question mark, it's nearly over. We've got 5 more episodes, and I wonder whether you've got any thoughts about the next step.
Not really, David. I probably would like to listen to some of the episodes now. I haven't had much chance. No, I'm very excited we're nearly there, but sad in a way. But I do want to say how good it is to see you, Mary-Anne and Andre, and to hear a little bit more about your ministry just now. It really excites me. I'm just so thrilled that you're with us today. And I can't wait to our conversation.
Okay, well, things are definitely getting extremely serious in this story and coming to a head. The passage follows on from Peter disowning Jesus, which, Steph, you talked about with Pete Gregg, and Jesus before Pilate, which we discussed with Ted Trost. As usual, Lucy Warner is going to read the passage for us before we start the discussion. So over to you, Lucy.
The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Okay, well, I think we're going to take this passage in one go, but talking beforehand, I think Andre and Mary-Anne are going to approach this from a slightly different angle from Stefan, which is fantastic because you can look at the gospel in so many different ways, can't you? Andre, would you like to set out your stall, if you like, and kind of explain what you see in this passage? Yeah. And then come back to Stefan a bit later.
Thank you, David. What a privilege we have to take a little portion and replay it, kind of looking at it from different angles to explore all its meaning. That's such a useful tool to have. I wish we could do it in real life, just kind of pause an event and replay it to delve into its meaning. But that little portion obviously finds its meaning in a larger context and a larger story, as well as in the detail. Now, what I want to do is to create just a sense of what the bigger context is and the bigger story. Because what I think the first hearers of the story and what the witnesses experienced in those events is something that they've experienced many times before. This is not the first time a troublemaker was identified and mocked before his execution. In fact, this scapegoating process, this means by which we take the collective frustrations and turmoil of a community and identify the outcast on which we can have this cathartic release of all our frustrations. That kind of story is as old as humanity. I think that is part of what has made us human, is this ability to transform our frustrations from a war of all against all into a conflict of all against one. And we can see that all the Gospels seem to race to this conclusion. In the beginning of the story, we're still not quite sure about who the guilty one is, who's going to pay the price. But eventually the mob comes into agreement that whether this person is guilty or not is not that important. It's like Caiaphas, he tells the rest of the Sanhedrin, you don't understand anything. What we're actually dealing with is, who do we want to perish, the whole nation or one person? Mm-hmm. I think that's how the scapegoating process always works. We're trying to preserve the current order by expelling our irritations, our frustrations beyond the boundary of our current order and identifying that victim. And that process, I'm going to throw it open to discussion now, but I think that is a process that everybody recognized. I think what is difficult for us today sometimes is to see how that process still plays itself out in our lives, because we read the story and because we know it from beginning to end, we're already on the side of Jesus. We find it very difficult to identify with the soldiers. In fact, we find it quite difficult to identify with the disciples. We don't want to deny Jesus. But I think one of the most important identifications to make is to recognize that story structure is still repeating itself in our daily lives today. We still inclined to identifying a victim where everyone can agree that this is the guilty one. And once we've done that, we feel justified in mocking. It can be as simple as my political party gives me a sense of identity, and therefore I feel justified in mocking anyone from the other tribe. Whatever our group situation is, it still leads us to that place where we often feel justified in victimizing others. And I think the big revelation that Jesus brings into human consciousness is this suggestion that our victims might be innocent. And that is something that I think is unique about his message. Now, up to that stage, and it's displayed in the actions of the soldiers, they are all convinced. We're on God's side. We're on the government side. We are doing God's work, getting rid of the troublemaker. But this is that beautiful moment of doubt that Jesus plants in human consciousness, and that is God on the side of the current order? And that is why the early Christians had a very healthy suspicion of their governments, because they're the ones who killed their savior. Yeah. So that's kind of the big context that I wanted to throw out, the scapegoating process, and this way in which Jesus comes to subvert the assumptions that's present within that political scapegoating process.
Yeah, I love that idea, guys. I think that's amazing. And I particularly resonate with the idea that God isn't necessarily on the side of the establishment. In this case, I think by now, those who are listening to this story would have really got the picture that God actually is opposed to the establishment, insofar as they are given an opportunity to listen to his son, who speaks with his authority, and they've rejected him. And as a result, sadly, judgment is on its way. So, yeah, you're right. And I think the whole of the establishment, as you say, it's not just the Jewish authorities, it's the Roman authorities. It's not just the crowds, but it's even the disciples. They kind of all band together against the one who's the victim. You know, I have a question for you guys. I just wondered, you hinted at this in what you just said, but what your main message, I think, is humanity has not changed. We are still doing this. And what the story of Jesus has opened up for us is the opportunity to reflect that when we do it, we might be perpetrating a crime against God and against justice.
Yeah.
And you gave one example of a political party that you might be part of, and you might feel justified in slagging off someone from another party. But as you were talking, I found myself thinking, hold on, this is a bit like holding us human beings to the mirror. I began to think, and didn't want to think, but I began to think of some horrible situations where we have done this, where we picked upon the innocent. As communities, we pick upon the innocent and we've destroyed them. Could you say a little bit more about the sorts of examples you may have in mind, where we still do this sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just bump me. I talk too much sometimes. I think this pattern is something that's not just repeated throughout human history, but in our individual lives, we seem to repeat the history of humanity as a whole. And what that means for me within this context is that we are prone to take the frustrations that we feel within ourselves and project them beyond ourselves. The first thing that we want to do is not to actually deal with the source of frustration within ourselves. We'd like to deal with it outside of ourselves. And that is what the mythology, the stories we've told ourselves have always done. Let's all agree that the community is right. And we find an individual whose condemnation will not have too many repercussions. Or even better, we find the individual outside of the boundaries of our community and we blame that one. But I think personally, we develop our own personal myths, where my issues and my problems were never really my own. It was my parents, it was my spouse, it was that friend, it was that situation. And we we find it difficult to actually correctly diagnose the problem. And the problem is never outside alone.
Yes.
There's problems outside, but that's not the only place it is. And that's why I so love James when in chapter 3, where he kind of summarizes all of human conflict. And he says, why is there conflict? It's because of your desires being unfulfilled. And that is why there are wars. That's why there's conflict amongst them. We can all boil it down not to just some external situation, but we can boil it down to unfulfilled desires. And you ask, but you don't have. And that's the frustration that boils to a place of conflict. Yeah.
That's wonderful. It
So
reminds Sorry.
Are there any solutions to this in this passage?
I was actually just thinking, because Steph, you mentioned, seeing in a mirror. And I think that the 2 Corinthians 3, I think it's 18, where he says, beholding him as in a mirror, we are transformed from one degree of glory to the other. And I think this is the very thing, is if we are holding up ourselves and beholding the crowd and, the desire of others as our model, which happens naturally. That is how we grow. It's instinctive. But to turn our focus to the mirror that is presented in Christ, who models a whole new way of being human. And here we don't see this unfulfilled desire just kind of, being kind of echo chambered or bounced off one another, but we see a whole new desire that is fulfilled in relationship. And as we behold him, and we behold a life that is a whole new way of being human, we realize that if we keep on dealing with evil in this world by anything other than forgiveness, which is what he modeled, then we will continue, like Andre said, projecting our fear, our hatred onto others. And so I think therein is the solution that we model with Jesus.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. I love it, what you just said. And it reminds me of two things. One, there's something I'm quite fond of, not really well practiced in, but it's something called non-violent communication, where you're nodding your head, so that's good. And it's like, you don't blame the other one in terms of an argument. You actually think about what's going on within me. That what's starting this process of tension and being triggered exactly? What are my needs? What desires are being unfulfilled here? Rather than saying, it's the other person's fault. That's the reason why I feel so angry, or whatever it might be.
Yes.
And I think that's brilliant. So on an individual level, that really speaks to me. But also on the more political level, it suddenly occurs to me, this is why political parties can't agree. They are always going to be right, and the other party are always going to be wrong. There is no coming together and agreeing that actually we haven't got all the answers, and that we aren't necessarily able just to do it by human resources alone. So yeah, it really speaks to me what you said.
Yeah.
And instead of strengthening our resolve in that way of, we have this echo chain, our party is right, our point of view is right, but instead to turn within, and it can be frightening, and it can be so difficult to turn within and gaze upon the evil that is present here and weep over it. And in that way, we can transform our point of view, and we stop outcasting and judging the other, but rather realize that the source of our frustration always starts with us.
Yeah. I think with political parties specifically, what they are really able to exploit is our tendency to then find our identity within a group. So when we find our identity in not necessarily who and what we are, but rather in what we are against, that is what great political artists do very well. They try and keep you blind about what they are for. And their policies and all of those, but let's just rile you up against the things that we are really against, and that is why you are in, is because together with us you are against the other. And this is something that the anthropologist René Girard kind of explored so beautifully when he explored the way in which rivalries escalate, and he showed that the greater the rivalry become, the more the rivals are simply reflections of one another. It was popular when he started writing his books, it was popular to blame religion for the violence in the world. And he made the statement that religion doesn't cause violence, rather it is violence that causes religion. In other words, violence was so fundamentally part of our evolution that religion became a solution by blaming one, by the scapegoating process of, instead of everyone killing everyone, let's find one to kill. And that kind of revolutionized human development, because we found a new kind of violence called sacred violence. And it was sacred, or our religious word would be sacrifice. And it was sacred because instead of everybody dying, one died. So this is a death that brought life to the community. This is the symbol of the scapegoat became exceedingly significant. And so in the context of that, what happens in the story of Jesus is not something new, but what is new is his interpretation. He's going to help us diagnose the problem correctly. And if religion has its origin in that sacred violence, in sacrifice, then Jesus is in effect the undoing of religion. He's the one that's going to bring this whole sacrificial system to an end. Because instead of this event being interpreted the way we always have, and that is God is on the side of the established order, the scapegoat is guilty, and we are doing God's work, suddenly every aspect is inverted.
Yes.
God is the one who suffers our violence, not the one who justifies it. The victim is innocent, and what does this leave us with? With the realization that our violence is our own. It's not justified, it's not God's command. And so the story is being subverted. And for a story to be subverted, Jesus has to enter it. He's got, and he chooses the role of the victim. Yeah.
We said at the beginning that you both and I would come from this story from a completely different direction. But I really truly believe that we'll meet in the middle around this idea that Jesus subverts the order that humanity lives by, has been upturned completely, and shown to be untrue and unreal and ungenerous. unjust. And I think that's so exciting. I don't know, David, whether this would be a good time for me to tell our listeners.
Yeah, why don't you look at some of the detail of the passage, and how you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I approach this passage first of all from the point of view of performance. When I do this passage in my dramatization of Mark's Gospel, it is almost always the one that shocks the most. Even though all I'm doing is spitting at a chair and pretending to hit it, you can feel the audience really, really unhappy in a good way, that they're caught up in the tension and the emotion of this experience of their beloved Lord, for many of them, suffering this indignity in the way that it's portrayed in this story. And so as I come to it now, it's hard to get over that experience, which I've shared with my audience. But I've begun to look at this story, as indeed all the stories in Mark's Gospel, from a different perspective, which is from a point of view of what must it have been like for a first century listener to listen to this, and what must have been going on in the mind of the author as he wrote it. And for me, this story is just one of those stories, this particular bit is one of those stories where we get to see that this narrative of Jesus Christ isn't just a history. It isn't just a report of true facts, things that actually happened, which it is. But within this story, within all the Gospels, there's a mind at work. And that mind has a particular purpose in view. And interestingly, for me, as we talk together, that purpose in view is, in my opinion, very similar to where you ended up just now in your discussion about scapegoats. So I don't think many people these days, particularly if you have studied this gospel, can get over the fact that there seems to be more going on than just the bare facts being reported. It's just the language that Mark uses, which is so suggestive. Most people, most scholars certainly would say that when Jesus is described as being given a purple robe to wear, when he's given a crown of thorns, as in this story, when he's acclaimed as King of the Jews, there's a large dose of irony going on in Mark's description. This is the sort of thing one would do. You would acclaim, you would dress up in purple, you would give a crown to someone who was king, who was Lord, who was the emperor, actually. This would be the way we would, in those days, approach the Roman emperor. But the irony is, of course, these people, the soldiers, are playing a joke, allegedly. But we know, as Mark's listeners, that it's not a joke. It actually is true. When they say, "Hail, King," he really is a king. When they put the purple robe on him, he really is the Lord. When they put a crown on him, we know, though the soldiers don't, he is the one who deserves that crown above every other person ever who's been born. And so what Mark is doing, most scholars would agree, I think, is he's highlighting by his use of language that Jesus is the true king. It's a little covered up. It's not absolutely stated, except perhaps right at the beginning of the story, when in the very first verse of the gospel. But here it's made pretty clear that where Mark is going is, in all of this, all the degradation and the shock of what's happened, which my audience respond to, actually there's something really positive being declared, the true king. And interestingly, the true king is nothing like the Roman emperor. This king suffers. He gives himself in love to the death. He is full of love and generosity to those who are oppressed. He's not an oppressor. He is full of justice and mercy. He is the exact opposite of the king as people, the king that people followed in those days, and indeed our own leaders. Let's be bold and say that. Our leaders still their main focus is, of course, power and having authority. And sadly, as we look over the world, we can see how leaders abuse that power and how there's injustice, there's oppression, there's violence, there's greed. This is the sort of thing the Roman Empire was all about. We haven't changed too much since those days. But Jesus represents a completely different kind of king, of a completely different kind of kingdom, where instead of injustice, there's justice, when instead of hatred, there's mercy, where there's forgiveness instead of the sort of thing we were talking about earlier, blame and oppression. It's the opposite. So the whole world, if you like, has been turned upside down. Jesus has changed it. And this is where I think you and I, we're basically saying the same thing, but using a different approach. That God has provided in Jesus the solution to humanity's problems. And Jesus' call to follow him in this story is meant to indicate to us, he is the way, he is the truth, he is the life. And this life of self-sacrifice, of love and service, humility and mercy and justice and kindness, this is the life we're meant to lead to. But I would say one more thing, and I know I've been going on quite a lot, but this is what really excites me about this story. It probably doesn't excite you or maybe any of our listeners, but I'll say it anyway. I talked about how this is like a kind of ironic twist on an enthronement of a Roman emperor. Well, it seems that I might be understating the case somewhat, because I've come across a scholar called Schmidt who was writing in the 1990s, and he was looking at these very words and the words of the rest of the crucifixion scene, and he was struck by the fact that the words being used here are words that would usually be used to describe a Roman triumph, where the emperor or a Roman general who was victorious in battle would be led through the streets by a company of soldiers. He would be wearing purple, he'd have a crown of laurel, and in front of him would be a bull, which would be basically the sacrifice offered to the gods in his stead. So there's a real connection going on here. And I know this is possibly a little bit difficult. It's difficult for me to mention because it kind of undercuts the possibility that this is literal history. But when you had the triumph, you would bring together the whole company of soldiers, just like here.
Yes.
Now, that's probably about 200 people.
Yes.
It kind of defies credulity to believe that 200 people would be turned out to look at Jesus being tortured. It's a lot of people. Yeah. It's told us that he goes into the praetorium. The praetorium is the place in Rome where the praetorium guard would gather. So there's some reflection on Roman history, it seems to me, more even than literal truth. But I don't know if that is the case. I'm just raising the issue.
I'm very excited about that as well, Stephen. That is so beautiful, especially if you think that what is happening in the background is a victory over evil.
Yes.
That if evil had its power because of our ignorance, then what is happening in this process is exactly that the whole process of scapegoating is being exposed, and in its exposure, he stripped the enemy of all their camouflage, so that the principalities and powers, the principles by which we rule our communities, can be exposed. And it is in that exposure that a very definite blow of victory is given to the enemy. So that's a profound insight. Beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. It's about the enemy and it's about evil, because Rome here in this story represents the enemy. He represents the powers that you're talking about. They're linked thematically all the way through the story, even so far as the pigs in chapter 5 who go down the hill into the sea, who are the effects of a man whose name is Legion being exorcised. The references there are considerable. The idea that political power of the kind that Rome represents is nothing more than, nothing less than evil. And this is how humanity in general has been oppressed over the centuries, over the millennia. But God has come to bring good, to overturn all of that and to destroy it and to, as you say, expose it on the cross.
Yeah. Beautiful. Love it. Love it.
Can I intervene and bring in a listener's question? That was amazing. We're running out of time, but Atlanta asks, was this Jesus's greatest mental anguish, even more so than what he experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane? There's a bit more to it. I think you've read it before than that, but do you think this was, what do you think? Steph?
To be honest, I find it difficult to know what was in the mind of Jesus. And having said that, I have to say, when I try and portray this, I try and give that some reflection on that fact, but it's so hard to know where the anguish really lies, the levels of anguish. Difficult. All I know, I can see where Atlanta's coming from, that this is huge, isn't it? What amazing suffering that he wore.
And what a revelation of the nature of God, that God is not a distant observer, but one who enters into the reality even of our suffering. That in Jesus we see a God who becomes flesh to such an extent that he understands us because he experiences what we experience. He doesn't just look at it from a distance. So whether that is the ultimate of his anguish, I think that the whole story is this escalation of the anguish that he goes through, what life brings to us, a sense of despair, a sense of, has God forsaken me? Yet in all those stages, he reminds us that there's a God who understands you because he has been there with you. And he's there with you now. Whatever anguish it is, he's not ignorant, neither distant from it. Because very often, I think in Christian circles, we think that suffering is kind of the result of God leaving. It's a distant God. That's why you're suffering. You've messed up somewhere. But Jesus comes and unveils a God who hangs out in our suffering with us and brings peace even there.
Wonderful.
I think too, the idea of suffering itself can be downplayed when we talk about our experience of religion in church, that actually Christian life does involve suffering, that we too are, if we say we are followers of Jesus, and I think this is one of the key messages of this gospel, we take on that cross ourselves. We're not immune to the suffering that Jesus experienced, whatever form that might take in our individual or collective lives. And if we take on that cross, that is to deny ourselves, but to, in so doing, gain life, actually. In suffering, through death, we do gain life, through giving of ourselves, and possibly even suffering.
We're going to have to wrap up this enthralling conversation, I'm afraid, so we're running out of time. Andre and Mary-Anne Rabe, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I think we were going to ask about your music, Mary-Anne. Where can we find that? Steph particularly has heard your music and wants to know more. Where can we hear you, find you?
So you can find together with all our material on the site alwaysloved, loved.net. And there are links there to the music. And yeah, there are 3 albums that you can download on there. It's also available on the usual platforms, Apple and all of those. So yeah. And I suppose the music is very much, I've written over the years very much in my conversation with my Abba, and so a lot of it is this understanding his love, his value of us, and then reflecting that back. So yeah, I'm so glad you appreciate the music, Steph.
I do, and I have to say, I think I've mentioned this to you before, Mary-Anne. It kind of dominates my quiet times. I don't listen to much more music, many more pieces of music than your 2 albums. And I don't know, they really do speak to me. So I would highly recommend it if you have a chance to get it.
Thank you so much, all 3 of you. It's been intriguing to be involved in this conversation, and I'm going to go and listen to Mary-Anne's album straight after this, I think. We've enjoyed having you with us too, lovely listener. We hope you'll check out our website, iam-mark.com, and the Facebook community. And why not check out alwaysloved.net if you want to, alwaysloved.net if you want to find out more about Andre and Mary-Anne's ministries. That's all we have time for today. So it's goodbye from Andre and Mary-Anne.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye from Stephen Smart.
Goodbye.
Bon voyage at the Edinburgh Festival, Stephen. And from me until next time, goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.